Welcome to my World History Notes, where I read from the book I wrote to teach homeschoolers world history. A Bible believer looks at world history. You can find it on lulu.com, amazon.com, or at the Bible Baptist bookstore. Or you can just follow me here. You won't have to agree with my conclusions, but it's important that a Christian be conversant in world history and have a general knowledge of people, events, places, and things that made us what we are today, where brought us to where we are today. This only goes through the end of World War II. Uh, the Cold War and modern times are a totally different subject. Could take up as much or more, and we have more information on it. But let's get back to where we're at. We're going to talk about the plague of Justinian today, a little bit, some other things, and I'll begin. And going to go back to Britain for a moment. Fox, the writer of the famous Book of Martyrs and his work about Christian history entitled Acts and Monuments, tells us Hengst and Horsa, leaders of the Anglo-Saxon invasion from northern Germany, didn't enter Britain until 449, years after more modern historians put the first wave of invaders there. So, it's a consideration that the Anglo-Saxon invasion. Some scholars say it was more of a gradual thing than simply an invasion. So, sort of like think about our America's Europeans' conquest of the Americas of North America. It didn't happen overnight. It took a couple hundred years before we completely conquered the continent. So, um, the Hanks Horse leaders of the Anglo-Saxon invasion from northern Germany didn't enter Britain until 449. It's possible also at this time that legendary King Arthur was a real flesh and blood British king fighting to keep the invaders at bay. Fox is quoting Williams of Malmesbury, an English historian of the 12th century. Another source for British and subsequent English history is the Anglo-Saxon chronicles and writings of a Christian called the Venerable Bede. Christianity had come to Britain in the first century and was firmly ensconced there. Schaff's History of the Christian Church lists no less than 10 different legends on how it arrived, but Fox agrees with one concerning the conversion of a King Lucius in the 2nd century. However, many writers, including Usher, have insisted that Paul visited Britain, and others, including English legend, um, pose an argument that Joseph of Arimathea not only went there to evangelize the people, but is buried there. I had a small bottle that a world traveler friend of mine bought at a gift shop at that supposed first church in Britain, filled with water from the Jordan River at the spot where the Catholic Church says that Jesus was baptized by John. This unsolicited relic from a Catholic friend is an example of how much human beings wish to rely on things to strengthen their faith rather than reading God's word and praying. In any event, the Emperor Constantine was born in Britain, as was a famous heretic, Pelagius. Tertullian, writing in 208, informs readers that Christianity was present in Britain in many places that Roman missionaries had not even visited. It's clear from the differences between the British or Celtic Christianity and that practiced by Rome that Britain was evangelized by missionaries from the Middle East, as Schaff implies. The main differences Schaff notes have to do with the date of the keeping of Easter and the authority of the Bishop of Rome. Now we come to the end of the 5th century and the beginning of the 6th. In his work Catastrophe, A Quest for the Origins of the Modern World, David Keyes, the archaeological correspondent for the London newspaper The Independent, tells us that in 535 mankind was hit by one of the greatest natural disasters ever to occur. For 18 months, much of the light and heat from the sun was blotted out, which resulted in plague, famine, climatic chaos, war, migration, and massive political change on every continent. The 100-year period after this saw the final end, Keyes tells us, of the super cities of the ancient world, the end of ancient Persia, the rise of the Byzantine Empire within the framework of the Eastern Roman Empire, the end of ancient South Arabian civilization, and the collapse of ancient American Teotihuacan, Tikal, and the Nazca, which I've mentioned previously. But on the other hand, from this disaster forward, we can witness the rise of Islam and the formation of nation states like France, Spain, England, Ireland, Japan, Korea, Indonesia, Cambodia, and the power of the Turks. Procopius, Roman historian, wrote of the climate changes as, quote, a most dread portent. 6th century church historian Evagrius gave a gruesome description of the plague that swept the Roman Empire, starting in Egypt, first appearing in the Mediterranean port of Pelusium. It entered by way of the Red Sea through a canal built by the Emperor Trajan and spread through Alexandria and Constantinople, killing a third of the empire's population and nearly half of the residents of the capital itself. John of Ephesus said that everywhere one looked were corpses, split open and rotting, with no one alive to bury them. He said that in Constantinople, as many as 16,000 people died in one day, and everywhere he went to try to escape the plague, he saw unharvested grain and domestic animals running around like wild beasts with no one to attend them. People dropped dead as they spoke to each other. The Emperor Justinian, whom this plague is named after by secular historians, began to deal with this massive death by burying citizens in mass graves, each capable of accommodating as many as 70,000 corpses. There were at least four great plague epidemics in the following century. Many historians see them as separate, distinct outbreaks, but when taken with the other events that happened at the same time, they can't reasonably be seen that way. It was, in fact, one long integrated event lasting between 180 and 210 years. Justinian's reign was a difficult one, and he eventually left the administration of the empire to others and devoted himself to theology. Durant notes in his fourth volume of the Story of Civilization, entitled The Age of Faith, that, quote, earthquakes were especially frequent in his reign. A dozen cities were almost wiped out by them, and their rehabilitation drained the treasury. In 542, plague came. In 556, famine. In 558, plague again. In 559, the Quadrigar Huns crossed the Danube, plundered Moesia and Thrace, took thousands of captives, violated matrons, virgins, nuns, and threw to the dogs the infants born to women captives on the march, and advanced on the walls of Constantinople. Not since Attila the Hun, defeated by the great general Flavius Aetius, called the last of the Romans, had ravaged both east and west a century before, had the empire been under such a great barbarian threat. It was a very difficult time as the ancient world entered into its death throes, excuse me, and the medieval world, or the Dark Ages, was beginning. It was at this time that the great general Belisarius, worthy of independent study, now an old man, defeated a Hun army in a battle which was noted in Ripley's Believe It or Not, because he lost not a single soldier in the engagement and the enemy was completely routed. Durant considers Justinian the last ancient emperor of Rome. That antiquity ended with him. The plague that devastated the ancient world started in the East African trading cities of Asina, Toniki, Rapta, and Elpone, and spread to the Roman world, as I said earlier, through Egypt. First, the Roman Empire was hit, then Persia, and eventually China was assaulted by it directly from the Middle East. Transported by ships from port to port, carrying grain, infected rats, and their infected fleas, it rolled its way up the Red Sea, collapsing civilizations of East Asia and the Southern Africa as well, as Bantu agriculture went into a decline. The ports of East Africa traded in 50 tons of ivory each year with Rome, and a trade controlled by Greek and Arab merchants. That's killing a lot of elephants. The plague ended this trade, fortunately, for the 5,000 or so elephants killed every year to sustain it. The Roman Empire was so devastated that the political turmoil that resulted ended with 70% of the land territory being lost to barbarians, who also lost a great deal due to the plague. Having had to pay a tribute of over 30,000 pounds of gold over 30 years as protection of money to the Avars, a barbarian tribe from the steppes, the empire, and understand, we're now talking about the eastern part of the Roman Empire. The West had collapsed politically and was really a loose confederation of kingdoms united by the Bishop of Rome, basically. But the Roman Empire, they called themselves Romans, their enemies called them Romans, still existed until 1453 with its capital in Constantinople. The empire was financially drained, though, from all this activity. Between 610 and 620, Greece was invaded by Slavic warriors, and its racial makeup and history were forever changed. By 616, the Persian army had captured the entire Middle East and was on the doorstep of Constantinople. By 626, with the capital surrounded by Persians and barbarians, the situation looked hopeless. In the end, the enemies were beaten back, with both sides being exhausted by war and disease. The Persians eventually fell to Arabic Islam, and the Avars to the rising Turkish tribes. In post-Roman Britain, there is no evidence that the Celts in the West had anything to do with the Saxon invaders in the East, and that included trading with them as well. Britain at this time was covered by an immense forest, all but gone now, and this isolation was much more possible than it would be in later times. The Saxons had a tough time making their conquest of the island complete for quite a while, with legendary and semi-mythical leaders like Arthur defeating them. Of the tribes vying for control of, quote, the Isles, were the Angles, from which we get our word English, In fact, the dominant invaders were Angles and Saxons, from which we get Anglo-Saxon, and the Jutes. Hundreds of tiny Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were eventually melded into the slightly larger units of Sussex, Surrey, Kent, Essex, early Wessex, East Anglia, and early Mercia. By the early 6th century, Anglo-Saxon expansion had virtually been brought to a standstill by Celtic or British resistance. Then, in around 535 or so, tree ring evidence tells us major climatic changes lasting for 20 years had a great impact on Britain. Irish annals speak of a famine in 538. There are records of heavy flooding in Britain, intensely cold winters, and a storm in London which killed 250 people, destroying many homes. In 550, large hailstones fell on Scotland. 2 years later, Scotland experienced what was called, quote, violent rain. The winter of 554 was extremely severe, and in 555, there were severe thunderstorms across Britain. But nothing was like the bubonic plague that reached Britain in about 549. The annals of Ulster and Ireland report losing many of their leading men to the plague. In Wales, the Welsh annals, important members of nobility, essential leadership against the Saxons died. Starting perhaps at Tintagel on the North Cornish coast, the mythical place of Arthur's conception, the plague swept the Isles. Towns and cities were reduced to a fraction of their population by this horrible plague. In several Arthurian stories and other poetry, there is a legend of the, quote, the wasteland, a place where nothing lives. These legends place the beginning of this event at around the time of Arthur's death in about 537 by some accounts. Most of the wasteland references appear to be in Celtic lands such as Wales. The ability to fight the Saxon invaders was eliminated by disease, famine, climate extremes. The Celts were reduced to the area of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, and the Anglo-Saxon invasion was complete. The former Roman province of Britain, birthplace of emperors, was now becoming England. The plague swept through France and Spain as well, making great political changes along with changes in population centers. The emergent states of France, named after the tribe called the Franks, united under the most famous king who had promised to convert Christianity if he won his greatest victory, which he did, Clovis, and Spain, but Clovis was his name, and Spain, conquered by the Visigoths, were made possible in part by the devastation wrought by this disease. It's interesting to note that the Visigothic version of Christianity was called Arian. However, the Catholic Church by this time was calling all beliefs not in line with theirs heretical and Arian. It was a common pejorative issue used by them to denigrate their enemies. And I want to make a point. When I say nations, kingdoms, until the last 500 years or so, the concept of nation state was kind of alien. Kingdoms were basically owned by the king and the nobility. You were a possession of your sovereign. So, I say France, I'm going to think in terms of Frenchmen of 1200. We think of himself a little differently than a Frenchman of 1900. So that's kind of a little more complicated than I wanted to get into. That's something you can look into, the rise and merging of nation states. But anyway, this has been about the Great Plague, and we're going to talk about China, Korea, Japan, and the Americas next at this time. And thank you for watching.